This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Not everyone is careful with your personal information, which might explain why there's a victim of identity theft every 5 seconds in the US. Fortunately, there's LifeLock. LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats to your identity. If your identity is stolen, a US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year by visiting lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by University of Northern Iowa political scientist Justin Holmes, as well as a new conservative voice on the show, attorney Sam Dewey. Justin and Sam, great to be here with you today.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Great to be here.
So, Sam, you're the new guy here in the booth, as it were. And so I thought before we got going, you could let listeners know a little bit about you, just to give folks a sense that, you know, you're just not some random guy I picked off the street and said, hey, I need a conservative. How about you, dude? So, Sam, why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Great. So I'm one of the many lawyers in D.C., but I'm also one of the lawyers who came to D.C. because I like the D.C. practice. I like the intersection of law and politics because you get so many different legal issues, be it Senate procedural issue, be it bizarre intersection of tariff regulations with congressional authority, be it chocolate content labeling and chocolate purity. It's just, you get everything. And you also get every subject matter, from pressurized wood to chocolate purity to, you know, what constitutes bourbon, to figuring out how different banking instruments work and intersect on a policy level. So I've always liked that. Subject matter changes, specifics of the law change, although the general framework is kind of the same for a DC lawyer. And I've had a lot of experience. I've served in the administration. I've been a staffer over in the Senate, and I've been a staffer over in the Hill, and I've had a couple of stints at private practice as well. So I like to say I've seen these issues from a lot of different perspectives, and I'm really excited to be here because it's always fun. I've always loved, since law school or college, really, having a really good discussion about the political events of the day, hearing different viewpoints, and being able to point different things out and let people fully understand an issue.
Yeah. And it is great to have somebody who has experience in the trenches, as it were. And so we are looking forward to your insights on things. Now, naturally, you'll be wrong about a lot, but that's okay. So a good spirited partisan back and forth is always a fun thing, I think. So before we get to that, though, I do want to say we like to mention whenever a prominent politician passes, just at least a brief thing. And this last week, we did have such a death. Charlie Rangel, long-term Democratic member of Congress. He was first elected way back in 1970, and he retired in 2016 after winning his 23rd term. But it blows my mind. Anyway, he was a reliably liberal vote in the House, and I think most people would say he had a very gregarious, I'll say, personality. He was also the first Black chair of the very influential House Ways and Means Committee, as well as a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. He was also involved in a number of ethics controversies over the course of his, well, I guess it was nearly a half century in the House. Most notably, that was in 2010. He was actually censured by the House in a bipartisan vote for 11 counts of violating ethics rules. So Charlie Rangel, whether you loved him or hate him, if you were around at the time, you probably had an opinion on him. He was that sort of guy. Sam, any thoughts on Charlie Rangel?
So, I think he was both an institutional figure and he was a transitional figure, given how far his career stemmed when he first came into Congress to where he was. And I think he did a lot of good for advancing some of the principal causes he believed in. But I think, unfortunately, he was also one of those individuals who, in his transitive crossing generational lines, also did some harm, kind of with all the ethical issues and how he went about his business. So I think it's a mixed legacy, but overall, love him or hate him, disagree with him. I kind of have to admire someone who was in for that long. And when he first came into Congress, came in a very, very odd time set following the Adam Clayton Powell, still in the middle of the civil rights movement, and setting aside the ethics stuff, which is mainly on the side, did consistently advocate for what he believed in. And I think he'll probably be remembered for that. And ultimately, I would say the ethics stuff is unfortunate, but you should judge him for what he accomplished for the causes he consistently believed in. And I think he did a lot there.
Justin?
I think he is sort of the last of the civil rights generation, and there really aren't many of those left. I think I largely agree with Sam here that, I think on policy, his record is quite strong if you agree with him on policy. The ethics things are sort of an unfortunate footnote there, maybe more than a footnote. But I think, judging him in his totality, it's certainly a pretty great loss, even though he's been out of politics for a while now.
All right. Well, that's pretty much my take as well. So on that note of agreement, we will move on from Charlie Rangel to, well, what probably everyone expected to be our top story this weekend. It is on Wednesday. A 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of International Trade unanimously ruled against President Trump's emergency tariffs. And the judges, who were appointed by Presidents Reagan, Obama, and Trump in his first term, they concluded that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, that was cited by the administration as the legal authority for those sweeping levies, that it doesn't allow the president to impose unbounded tariffs. Now, the ruling, which is being appealed by the administration, gives the executive branch 10 days to end the tariffs. It doesn't affect tariffs issued by the administration through other legal authority, and that includes those increased steel and aluminum tariffs, as well as the 25% duty on foreign auto imports. Now, the day after that, then, the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit issued an administrative stay of the decision while it considers the administration's appeal. And the administration successfully argued that absent a stay, U.S. foreign policy and national security would suffer immediate irreparable harm, and it could also restrict the president's leverage in trade negotiations and possibly call into question trade deals that have already been reached since so-called Liberation Day. Now, the administration's response has kind of brushed this off. Kevin Haslett, the head of the administration's National Economic Council, called the Court of International Trade's ruling a hiccup in the tariff strategy that was caused by activist judges, including apparently a Reagan and Trump appointee activist judge. Now, the White House domestic policy chief, Stephen Miller, he went even further, saying the judicial coup is out of control. There you go. I think it's generally expected that even if the administration loses on appeal, they will find other ways to impose tariffs, though it's likely that those methods are going to constrain President Trump's ability to put in place the sort of indefinite sweeping tariffs that he really seems to favor. So, Sam, let's start with you, and let's start with that decision from the Court of International Trade, which we don't talk about a whole lot, but here it's pretty important. What's your take on their decision? Because I should point out, at least it seemed important to me at the time, that they didn't just enjoin that action. They actually granted summary judgment, which surprised me at least a little bit. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So what they did was they said the merits of the dispute are fully briefed. We don't need to rule on any preliminary motions. We're just going to enter judgment and say the tariffs are unlawful. And that's that. They struck down the tariffs and the Emergency Powers Act and under other provisions with with some exceptions. They did it under different ways. For example, whether or not there was an emergency in the case of Canada and fentanyl. In another case, they said there isn't an emergency in China and fentanyl, but then they said there's a problem with the nexus between the presidential actions and the emergencies. And my two kind of foundational takeaways here are, one, this is not a new issue. If you read the opinion, there's a Yodo case and Yodo 2, and there's a lot of discussion of cases that go back to actions by President Nixon. And this has been a long-standing, long-running issue and line that the courts have been policing as to the executive's discretion under wartime emergency powers and under other emergency powers to set tariffs. And what you've essentially had, going back really to the Depression and World War II, is a decision by Congress that it can't react quickly enough to changing circumstances and needs to delegate tariff setting power within certain guidelines to the executive branch. And that general proposition is at its highest level uncontroversial. What I think this case is really getting into is, what are the limits of that delegation and how do you police that delegation? And how much power are you delegating, and how narrowly are you circumscribing the discretion and the decision points that have to be made in that delegation? And there's an interesting side note, because the way most of these statutes were designed to work when they were passed was prior to a case called INS versus Chadha, which abolished the so-called legislative veto. So when most of these cases were passed, the president could say, I'm putting a 50% tariff on Mexico because of this emergency. And then a simple majority of Congress through expedited voting could reverse that tariff. Post-Chadha, you need an act of Congress, which means you have to have a veto-proof majority, which in practice means the delegation is not controllable by Congress. Now, you could redraft the statutes to put that control back in place by saying the tariff is only in effect for 50 days unless Congress passes legislation to implement it. But that's really the substantive thing, and I think it's a very hard substantive thing, because practically Congress they could in theory have the bandwidth. They don't currently, in terms of professional staff and experts that would be needed to study this issue, and they certainly don't have the will to react in real time that these types of emergency tariff situations require. So that's the kind of legislative backdrop. In terms of the legal backdrop, legal arguments are over the same issue. And the other interesting part about this is, obviously, the Court of International Trade made its ruling, was immediately appealed to the Federal Circuit, which normally sits in 3-judge panels. However, the administrative stay was issued by the entire court. Most people aren't familiar with practice of the Federal Circuit. It's specialized. I'm certainly not. But my understanding is that what that means is that the entire court said, this case is so important, we're going to hear it ourselves. And to my mind, that's actually a good thing, because part of the issue with a lot of these lawsuits and the timing of these lawsuits is that starting in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Administrative Conference of the Courts, which is the judiciary's lobbying arm, started going to Congress saying, you have to make all judicial review discretionary. All these expediting statutes muck up our dockets and make the courts more inefficient. So you went from having a situation where serious cases, most of these challenges to presidential EOs would be heard by a 3-judge district court with an immediate appeal to the Supreme Court, to the system we have today. In between that, you had a lot of Court of Appeals saying, well, if this is a really important case, D.C. Circuit did this a lot in the 60s and 70s, we're going to initially hear it en banc because we know it's important. We need to move it along. Having a judge hear it, then a 3-judge panel, then en banc, and then almost inevitably the Supreme Court, that's just too much. So maybe we're seeing a trend back to that with them taking it en banc. I think regardless of how the court parses the lines, the Trump administration is going to be able to put the tariffs in place because, one, this has just been delegated to such a great extent to the president, and two, Congress can't really claw back the delegation because they A, need a veto-proof majority, which they'll never get, and then B, they don't have the will to do this themselves.
Yeah. Justin, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that this is, part of a pattern with Trump where, everything is an emergency and he's trying to declare, emergency powers around a lot of things. It reminds me of, the immigration stuff where, he's trying to declare that, we're under invasion and things like that. And I think that it's really a shame that Congress has delegated so much of this to the presidency. And I think not just Trump, but, essentially what we're getting here is this ability to essentially, unitarily expand executive power over a pretty silly pretext, I think, in a lot of cases. Not to say that fentanyl's bad, like don't take fentanyl, kids, but does that constitute an emergency in the way that these statutes originally conceived emergency? My strong suspicion is no. The connection to trade is frankly pretty flimsy. This isn't about tariffing pharmaceuticals or anything like that. It's about tariffing everything. And frankly, the language that he uses everywhere else is that this isn't about fentanyl really at all. When it comes to China, he's talking about, unfair trade and frankly, just even that we have a deficit and that's the emergency, So I think that this is really, quite a problematic area. I agree with Sam that clawing that power back is perhaps hard, but it seems like there needs to be some sort of clearer check on this, because we can't just have presidents sort of declaring emergencies all the time and, my power expands during this. The temptation, I think, is much too great. And frankly, it just sort of upends sort of the traditional balances of power amongst the branches.
It seems to me that we're seeing an interesting reversal, because many of us remember, all of us here, I'm sure, remember when President Biden at the time tried to forgive pretty much all student loan debt using something called the HEROES Act. And I think a lot of folks on the right, so wait a second, that wasn't intended to be that at all. And now, of course, the tables have been turned. And to me, I feel like there's a certain irony here, because for a long time, conservative legal scholars, now Trump's no conservative, but put that aside for a second, have been talking about how, we have to be concerned about the non-delegation doctrine and the major questions doctrine. And I think here we can see maybe the right sort of hoisted on its own petard, as it were, in that if you look at, for instance, the non-delegation doctrine, you can say, well, what exactly is the intelligible principle here guiding and limiting the president's use of this delegated power? Honestly, in this case, I sure don't see one. And clearly, the initial court didn't see one. And even if you don't want to go there, you can say, well, wait a second. Is this a matter of vast economic and political significance? Well, if it is, then under the court's, fairly new, not brand new, but, it's still fairly newish, major questions doctrine, well, then Congress must speak clearly on the issue. And if you read IEPA, it actually says literally nothing about the authority to impose tariffs. So I would think that this is a case that it feels to me about if the courts follow if the Supreme Court certainly follows what it's done in the past, this is about as slam dunky as it gets, I would think, at least on, I would argue, the global tariff thing. Maybe you can make an argument maybe for China and Mexico and the fentanyl sort of emergency, but even there, that's kind of, I think, a stretch. Anyway, that's my take on this. Sam, you're a conservative attorney. What do you think about my focus on the non-delegation and major questions doctrines here?
I think that's correct, and I think that is an issue, and that's where a lot of these cases are going to go. A couple of things. I think you have to see this in terms of the comments about, is this consistent, in light of two things historically. The first is the court has said the president has very unique, very vast powers in foreign relations because that requires negotiations, discussions, etc. And that's something where you uniquely defer to the president in this area that makes it a little different than the HEROES Act or most of the other cases under Biden. The second part is, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing at all, but you really do have a rich history going back to President Franklin Roosevelt of Congress saying, here are very few principles, you just do it. And the executive doing it. This has been, a long-running thing.
But it's been something that folks on the right have been screaming about for forever. Oh, my God, right? We can't have this sort of activist liberal presidents running around with this crazy unchecked bureaucracy doing all this stuff. And so it seems to me I guess I agree in some ways in that, the Trump argument, at least in part, has been, well, listen, this is really important. We need this as a matter of just practicality. And in fact, the initial court said, hey, we're not talking about the wisdom or the likely effectiveness of the president's use of tariffs. We're not talking about the leverage argument. They might be right about all that, but that doesn't matter if that exceeds the president's power. It's too bad that the Constitution, it would be a lot easier if Donald Trump were just King Trump. Then he could do everything he wanted. It'd be easier to negotiate. He could be like one of those Gulf state monarchs and just do handshake deals with everyone. But we have a system of separated powers and checks and balances, and that applies to everyone, including would-be Emperor Donald Trump. At least go ahead.
Look, I get where you're coming from. I mean, I'm going to disagree with your predicate characterizations of the president, but all I am saying is this is an area where presidents of both parties have been equally expansive.
Sure.
And it is in that unique foreign affairs power. And the other part I will say is having had some visibility into take the issue of fentanyl trafficking. Tariffs were long used as a tool to influence foreign policy. And again, this just goes back to the capacity of if there was a decision made long ago by a Democratic Congress with a Democratic president, FDR, a situation where the president has this power and it's been used by both parties, and both parties really haven't complained about it that much beyond Nixon, when Nixon did it, and everybody complained about everything Nixon did. Presidents of both parties have used this extensively because tariffs are a potent foreign policy tool. And if we went back to a system where, Ulysses Grant can walk into call over the foreign affairs chairman, and they can start slugging back whiskey and say, we have an emergency, I need this, can you get this done this afternoon? And the foreign affairs chairman says, sorry, boss, whips the vote, and it's out within, a day or two because it makes sense. And we're dealing with a time when communications take longer, okay, fine. And I think there are ways around it. You could certainly pass bills that give the president discretion, but require presidential confirmation. And the interesting thing is that Mike Lee and some other conservatives have been proposing that under President Trump and Biden, and they can't get any Democrats to go along with them. So it is a conservative issue, but I think it'd be good to see bipartisan legislative leadership on it, which to my mind has been lacking. And the final point I just want to make on the fentanyl thing, because I am familiar with the issue, is tariffs are a really potent weapon there. And it is very hard to get someone to address precursors. Like, I can think of another solution, which is China was not providing prepackaging information, which is central to interdicting drug shipments. And it was investigated actually by the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. They did a really great report. It had a classified annex. And the solution was they actually had to pass legislation that essentially said, okay, you can't mail packages anymore, which is a pretty rough diplomatic tool. You just can't mail them without this information. Like, okay, I don't really care. Whereas the tariffs are a lot more flexible. So I really wouldn't, particularly on the fentanyl angle, I think that's going to be very hard actually to sustain on appeal, because once you've found, yes, there is an emergency, I think the nexus question, there is a very clear nexus. It is a very clear, effective way to produce results when you look at the real politic of foreign power. So I think that's going to be very hard to say, given the president's discretion, once it's conceded there's an emergency as to China or Mexico on the fentanyl, he can't say, and the record does say this is probably our most effective tool to get them to do more searches to interdict packages. Because otherwise, You're going to pass legislation that says no packages can come in from Mexico unless the Mexican government does X, Y, and Z screening. I mean, that's a pretty blunderbuss approach rather than putting tariffs that can go on and off very quickly. I mean, there you put in an act of Congress, you're either going to have a presidential waiver provision, same problem, or you're going to have Congress repeal the act. It's not going to work in that setting. And again, I'm from a pure separation of powers point. I am personally probably with Mike Lee. It would make more sense to give the president this type of discretion initially, given the system and that Congress is not willing to work more than 3 days a week, and do it that way. I just don't see it happening from a bipartisan support or a practicality method of Congress just doesn't want to work.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
I'm Cindy Lauper with fellow Cosentix advocate, Chef Michelle Bernstein.
We'll share our experiences with plaque psoriasis, with psoriatic arthritis, and Dr. Panico will talk about the possible connection.
Cosentix secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis 300 milligram dose and adults with active psoriatic arthritis 150 milligram dose. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentix. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some are fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur.
Learn more at 1-844-COSENTIX or Cosentix.com/Cindy.
One thought I had on the fentanyl issue, and I want to get Justin your thoughts on this as well, is that even if we assume that there's a much stronger case, and I agree with you, Sam, that there is, when I read IEPA, it only allows emergency powers to address, in the words of the statute, an unusual and extraordinary threat. And so I read that and then I think, well, okay, fentanyl has been an issue now for over a decade. It really kind of started big in 2012, 2013 or so. But things are getting significantly better. I mean, between 2023 and 2024, fentanyl overdose deaths dropped by over a third. And so I think even there, it's a stronger case, certainly, but it still seems to me to be at least a little shaky, especially if we're talking about, say, Canada as opposed to Mexico and China. And so, Justin, why don't you jump in on that? And then, Sam, if you want to comment, we can go back to you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, this gets into the weeds. Well, not the weeds, but the heart of it, I suppose, is, what really constitutes an emergency. And, I'm not sure that frankly, fentanyl at its worst was an emergency in this context. Making all these hand gestures as though I'm on video. But, I'm not sure that in this context, fentanyl really does constitute an emergency. Again, it's a bad thing. But is it an emergency that's triggering in a trade sense? I'm less sure. I was going to maybe push back a little bit on what Sam said about kind of what's a blunderbuss and what's not. I feel like something like the postal inspections are more clearly targeted to the actual problem. This blanket tariff, against China over one product, essentially, to me seems like the much more sort of scattershot, non-precision kind of approach. And again, I think a lot of this to me is that it's just a pretense. It really is, again, so much of Trump's rhetoric. I mean, the fentanyl comes up occasionally, but almost everything that he says about trade with China is not about that. I mean, this is maybe an issue, but he's not using this really to deal with fentanyl at all. It seems like that's a fairly tractable sort of thing. And yeah, Sam, I think is potentially right. If, you could turn this off pretty quickly if they make the changes that you need to make. But what we're seeing with Trump is that, one, it's targeting everything. two, it's covering the rhetoric is really about trade imbalances. It's not about fentanyl at all. And I have a very hard time with that as sort of a rationale for the rest of this on those grounds.
Sam?
I mean, the trade imbalance is kind of a separate basis, and I think that can rise to a level of emergency. It is a bit in the eye of the beholder, but I certainly think the trade imbalances are unsustainable and concerning and require action. On the fentanyl specific issue and the blunderbuss issue, I think the blunderbuss issue is more, if you pass an act of Congress, you need an act of Congress to take it off. Here, you can dial in much more quickly. And again, that just goes to congressional capacity and the fact Congress isn't doing its job. And I think on the fentanyl issue, yeah, it's been around for a while. Yeah, deaths have been reduced. I mean, I can tell you from having worked on it, part of that's because of the wide availability of Narcan and forcing insurers to cover Narcan. I was involved in that. You know, it literally used to be if I was prescribed a opiate because I had surgery and I had little kids, and my doctor said, I want you to have Narcan around just in case your 5-year-old, the worst happens, insurance wouldn't cover it. They'd make you pay $300-400 out of pocket. So I think we've had great progress there, but I do think, and this is very issue specific on the opioids, but I really think it's important. I haven't paid a lot of attention to this. The emergency aspect now that gets in the international relations is we know where the precursors are being made. And we know that they're being made there because those governments are okay with it. They are okay with taking the profits. They are on the take, and they're okay with it. So that's, I think, the real record impetus for saying, yes, there is an emergency in this case, is that we've now isolated the problem to a specific key causative factor. Yeah, there are others, which is you have a bunch of foreign governments that are basically okay with manufacturing and shipping in precursors. And that's just the ugly truth of it. And that's got to be confronted openly. And that's what the president is doing.
Let's talk about the politics of this, because in a weird way, it seems to me that because I think what's going to happen is when this gets to the Supreme Court, as I assume it will, that I disagree with Ken about the court being, corrupt or what have you. I think they're going to stick with their principles and say, you know what, we've got this major questions doctrine, we've got this non-delegation doctrine. And while this might be, there was this old joke where Justice Scalia said he wished judges had a stamp saying stupid but constitutional. I think, right? It's possible for a law to be really stupid, but I think this is the reverse. Maybe you can argue that this would be a good power for a president to have, but I would argue that in that case, it would maybe be smart, but unconstitutional. But I think what the court's going to say is, no, you can't do this. And politically, I think this is actually, if that happens, a benefit for President Trump, because he can point to the activist judges. He's already railing against, of all things, the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo for conning him into appointing all these judges who are clearly awful, right? And so he's going to be able to blame someone, which is what he cares about. He's going to be able to avoid the awful short-term economic problems we're going to see with the sort of tariffs that he wants. And so Donald Trump gets everything he wants, basically, and doesn't have to deal with the economic, negative consequences. So I think that's a win for Trump. And I, in fact, think a lot of GOP world, as opposed to MAGA world, which is all for the tariffs, they're actually hoping that this is the result that they want. What do you think about that, Sam? And then Justin, I'll ask you.
I think your read of the politics is largely correct. I'd say I think it's a win-win for the president. If the powers are upheld, he is acting aggressively to restrict fentanyl, and this is an effective way to get at the problem. We've already seen responses to the tariffs. And then two, it is, an effective way to show he's addressing the trade imbalance, which, to be clear, both parties are responsible for. I mean, the Clinton W. Bush cabal on this was pretty bad with regards to China, and I'm putting that diplomatically. I think that, yes, the base will get happy about the Supreme Court. I think it'll kick off a fight about how this legislation will be dealt with in the future, which may actually be a good thing, to my point of Lee and some others have been saying, please, can we have an honest and open conversation and put in rules for both parties, and haven't been met by the other side. I think that'll be good if that does happen. I'm not sure that there is that much disagreement between GOP and MAGA on tariffs. I think it's a question of degree. I think the question of degree is how targeted are we? I think there's general consensus. I've heard no one dispute the proposition that we need to more aggressively use tariffs as a foreign trade tool, given how badly our country is getting ripped off by many, many countries. I can remember, give you an example. I'm a lawyer. If you're being involved in cases where to do a deal in China, you have to use a Chinese law firm, and you essentially have to sign over your IP to a joint venture, which under the national security law means the government can seize your IP without compensation.
Yeah, it's nuts.
It's freaking insane. And that's just an example. Japan's gotten a lot better, but they have some weird restrictions. And you just got to say this is a problem. It's not free trade. And that was the GOP divide. You have all these people saying, oh, tariffs are bad, they're free trade. And I think the party has come to a collective decision of free trade doesn't just mean that there are no, direct tariff barriers. It means, is the trade truly free competition? Are there any barriers? And I think it's just so clear that there is a problem and it needs to be addressed, that the question in the GOP is over. GOP is aligned with MAG on that. It's just a question of degree. And I actually think there's some level of alignment with the liberals side of it on, and this has always been an issue where you have like the Bernie Sanders. I can remember back during the Clinton days, you had, those of the Bernie Sanders ilk agreeing with those of the Jesse Helms ilk and trying to block the normalization with China. And they were correct. Emphatically, the history shows us. And I think that you have the same concern of, not going to say it's free trade, but do we really want a situation where because someone allows slave labor to be used, they can undercut production in our country? That's less of that's getting away from the free trade. That's getting away from the, it's a country with less environmental regulations and people don't care about the hours. They're willing to work 14-hour days. Okay, that's the choice. That's their country. Free trade is free trade. We'll just make a better product. Put that to one side. If we're getting into like guns to the head of Uyghurs making products, I think there's a pretty broad-based consensus. You have to act there too, and it's a big problem.
Justin?
I think I would find some of that more compelling if that was sort of explicit parts of the negotiations. It really seems like I agree with a lot of that. I think China has a lot of problems, and there is something I think sort of distasteful to we'll outsource our manufacturing to places that don't meet our standards and just look the other way, whether it's human rights or environmental or what have you. On the other hand, it really doesn't feel like anything Trump is doing addresses any of that. We're just going to throw this random number at China and we're going to vary it week to week. And it really seems like it's again, I feel like traditionally when we do tariffs, they're much more targeted and much more kind of specific goal oriented. And this whole sort of tariff regime has just been sort of random and hey, we'll show them sort of thing, rather than really getting into addressing any of those particulars that people might be concerned with.
Well, we will have a lot more to talk about with tariffs because this issue is surely not going away. But why don't we put it aside for the present, at least, and talk about something a little bit different. And, President Trump has said tariff is the most beautiful word to him. But I think you could make an argument that, well, pardon isn't that far behind, at least if we're going by actions, because he's had just over 4 months in his second term. He's issued 46 grants of clemency, including, of course, that big one on his first day in office, which covered the January 6th Capitol people, rioters, insurrectionists. Fill in your own word there. But I think what is really distinguishing in some ways President Trump's pardons and commutations from those of his predecessors, including, I would argue, President Trump in his first term, isn't just the sheer number. We're not used to seeing this many this soon. but the nature of the pardons, which I think a lot of folks are being doled out, not really based on merit, but based on political support for the president. I mean, if we take a look at the latest bunch of pardons, which came this week, we've got several lawmakers convicted on corruption charges, a former Army officer who violated COVID protocols, those reality TV shows, Julie and Todd Chrisley, they were convicted of tax evasion. And there's also Paul Walzak, who's the former nursing home executive, convicted of tax fraud. In his pardon application, it basically said, hey, by the way, my mom has donated millions of dollars to you and other Republicans, and, maybe that's worth some consideration, essentially. And so when we take a look at a lot of this, I think, number one, there's no question about the president's constitutional authority to grant pardons or commute sentences, as long as it involves federal law, and all these have. So we're not talking about whether or not what the president has done is illegal here, because it's not. It's perfectly legal. I think the bigger question is whether we're seeing a fundamental change, even from, again, President Trump's first term, in the basic criteria that are used to grant clemency, and whether President Trump is making this power more of a partisan tool than his recent predecessors. I mean, you could think back to, say, like a Bill Clinton and a Mark Rich, and that stunk to high heaven, but that was like one isolated thing at the end of a term. And now it's just like, it feels like, to me at least, that if you are a strong MAGA person, especially if you have been convicted of political corruption, there's a really good chance that you're going to be able to successfully lobby for a pardon. That's my take. Let's start with you on this, Sam. What do you think?
So I think that you can't really see this as anything more than a response to two factors. The first factor is that you have to look at the weaponization of government that has infected a lot of these cases. And the references to donations I took to be, everybody knew I was a Republican. So they came at me. And if you look at what the FBI, what the DOJ did in a lot of these cases, it's just not acceptable. And I can tell you, having from Baltimore, I've been in federal court there defending a 19-year-old kid who was failed by the system, who his first two drug arrests was, whatever, I'm going to take a plea, serve a month, get out, and then is sitting there in federal court facing 15 years on a mandatory. And I have seen how that system works, and I have seen with the poorest of defendants who were failed by the system on up to cases involving politically sensitive figures that there is a real problem of weaponization and just the tactics being used by the government being inappropriate. And this doesn't matter if we're talking, the 19-year-old failed by the system to the Republican. I think you've got a reaction of that this just cannot stand, that part and parcel of addressing every aspect of that is that we just can't have that. And I think some of the pardons are coming from that vein. Trump's pardon, I'm forgetting the title, but his pardon advisor comes from that community of, have we over-criminalized minority communities through that system where we failed them and they're getting hit with sentences? It comes actually from prison justice reform, and some of the other way comes from just some of the stuff that the government is up to and has been up to is just unacceptable. And you can say that regardless of politics or administrations. We can't do that. And the second part of this is, I just don't see how anybody's complaining about this after what Joe Biden did. Everybody's talking about it's just not comparable. He gave his entire family and a number of individuals blanket preemptive pardons for over a decade. And everybody thinks it's just Hunter Biden. It's not, knowing the cases. It wasn't just what Hunter Biden did. The reason the pardon had to run through to December is Hunter Biden repeatedly perjured himself in his House deposition, and DOJ had a full referral. Biden said, you're going to come after my family. That's unfair. Well, he left out in the statement, his brother, Jim Biden, also repeatedly perjured himself in front of the House. DOJ was sitting with a referral. He was pardoning, not generally, but also for very specific crimes. So I think, it just or commuting death row sentences, which was basically an illegal suspension of capital punishment. which has been enacted by the people's representatives. I just think after that, stop complaining about robust pardon power. The precedent was set. If you don't like it when it's on the other foot, then think about how it was being used when you, and I know I preface this by saying I think there are a lot of issues on auto pen, legal authentication, whether or not Biden actually approves some of those pardons. But, we know he signed the Hunter one. It's a wet signature. And you have to think about it from that perspective of you really can't complain about this. And when you have those two forces collide, the need to redress weaponized prosecutions and the fact that you have a series of actually abusive pardons by the other guy, I just don't quite understand why anybody's complaining about it from just a practical political perspective. It is what it is. If everybody wants to step back, restrict pardon eligibility, they can agree to that, but that is 180 degrees from where we are. And again, you got to take each case on the merits. And my understanding is some of the ones that just came down had real problems when you dug into the case. And again, I'm coming at that politically. I'm also coming at that from, I have seen the FBI and DOJ do some expletive deleted things to some poor kid who was failed by the Baltimore school system. And that's a big problem, and this is part of addressing it.
Justin, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree that there are a lot of problems with things that we criminalize and how poor people are treated in the system. I don't think that's any of these people that have been pardoned. Looking across this, he's not pardoning, unjustly convicted 19-year-olds in Baltimore. It's people that are famous. It's people who are donors. I can't get my head around Larry Hoover, who ran the Gangster Disciples in Chicago for decades, for all of this. Especially striking, given kind of our recent discussion of fentanyl 5 minutes ago. If Trump has these problems with drugs and crime, letting Larry Hoover out of all people is just shocking. It appears that was sort of a Kanye West cause célèbre, of sorts. But I'm not buying that across kind of these recent pardons that any of these were necessarily weaponized. You have, in the case of the Chrisleys, it's the daughter is campaigning for Trump. She flat out said, she's wearing a pink MAGA hat, and making videos on Instagram about, how she campaigned for them and how glad she is that he let them out. And it just seems to me, coming from, I think, frankly, a different place, which is, one is that Trump is largely relational. And this is, largely about people that are sort of on his team, on his side, et cetera, except for Larry Hoover, which I continue to not be able to get my head around. Two, I think this is about, we just don't think that fraud and tax evasion are big deals, and I think that in itself is a problem, as well. But I don't think this really engages with any of those issues in terms of other fairness. These are all generally wealthy, famous people, et cetera, who in many cases have connections to Trump. I think the other issue here is that this is the kind of thing that kind of excites him, because unlike everything else he does, there's not really anything you could do about it. Kind of to everybody's point, yeah, they're legal. And really beyond review. There is no real check as far as that goes. So, this is kind of an exercise of power that he seems to more or less enjoy. But I'm not seeing an upside here, whether he can do it or not.
Yeah, I will say in President Trump's defense, sort of in a way, I guess, is that I feel like in some way it comes from a sincere conviction that the government, once the government latches on to you, it's a horrible thing. I mean, one of the people he pardoned this last week, P.G. Sinfeld, was a Cincinnati city councilman, not at all a Trump guy. And, I think even maybe you can argue Eric Adams saying that's maybe more of a getting leverage for that immigration. But I really feel like the president has a sincere belief that this is awful and we need to stop this. And we especially need to stop it for people who are, supporting me, because Donald Trump sees an awful lot through the lens of personal grievance. I mean, when we talked that story, we were talking about the tariffs, when he said about the judges, how could this be anything other than Trump derangement syndrome, essentially? And I think that's how he sees so much of the world. And this is so personal. He's been involved in so much of this. Now, I would argue that in some cases, it's because he's crooked as hell. But in other cases, it is because I think there were some pretty questionable prosecutions against him that wouldn't have happened if his name weren't Donald J. Trump. So I guess I feel like the bigger issue here is, well, I'd like to see the pardon power constraint. I certainly had a problem with the Biden family pardons at the end, though I can understand it. You got a guy here in Donald Trump who seems very vindictive. I mean, he pulled security details and all kinds of other stuff from, people who disliked him in the past. And I think that's a concern, certainly. But I would love to see maybe some kind of requirement for Senate consent, like with appointments and treaties, maybe, or at least maybe less than that, amendments that might prohibit self-pardons and pardons of maybe immediate family members, administration officials. So people don't have the sense that, well, there's a get out of jail free card. I don't know. Maybe that would cause more problems than it would solve. I'm not sure, but this makes me kind of uncomfortable, certainly. Sam, you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right to highlight the Cincinnati one. And I think you have to look at his whole record of commutations. He actually did make a lot of commutations as part of the STEP Act. And he was the one who got criminal justice reform that everybody thought needed to go through. He had to roll some members of his own party. And I wasn't suggesting that this batch was some poor 19-year-old. I was just speaking more broadly to his record of exactly what you are articulating, which is that government gets its hands into you. Sometimes some bad things can go down, and you need to speak to that. I get and then I appreciate what you said about the Biden pardons, because, and I would say I could understand it if it were ask for Weinberger, I'm not going to send an old man to jail.
Sure.
And he was basically following orders pardon, and Bush owned that, completely owned it, as opposed to 180 degrees. I'm doing what I said I wouldn't do. I'm lying, changing my rationale. And again, I just go back to, this wasn't he's going to come after me. This was these two guys perjured themselves to block inquiry into financial dealings of the family, which I may have well been involved in. I mean, okay, that's about to me, as bad as it gets. And don't even get me started on the death row commutations, which I think are illegal on multiple grounds. But the fact that, a lot of people were okay with those, or the FBI one, murder, which may or may not have been done by accident. I just think that, man, it's just really hard, as I see it, to say anything other than, okay, this is the system we live in, where this type of stuff happens, and we're just going to go ahead and do it. On the pardon reform, I'm not necessarily saying there shouldn't be an academic discussion that lawyers shouldn't think about it, but where I come down is I think the experience of history, because after was seen as power, the crown, they didn't like it. I mean, I literally have on my desk the Attorney General's report from 1930 on the history of pardon power. Something else I'm working on, and a lot of states cut back on it pretty substantially. Some states do have like a parole board, et cetera. But I think the key thing that, and maybe it works in Texas where you have to have the parole board. I think the key thing that is unique to the federal pardon power is, one, foreign affairs implications, and two, the need to set uniform national policy. And it may not be a pardon, it may be an immunity, but I can tell you it's real. I mean, my grandfather had one of the cases. There were a lot of cases in the 1950s where you'd try to indict someone, big Cosa Nostra guy, you finally got him, and you'd be at the arraignment, and then these lawyers from Maine Justice would show up. Be like, what the heck are these guys doing here? This is a state RICO prosecution. Judge, we need to see you. Walk out. Judge says, you're dismissing the case. You're in D.C. a week later. Yeah, those guys, that's the cousin of the guy in Cosa Nostra who gave us the intel in Sicily, so we knew where to move our troops. We cut a deal. That's the dirty nature of politics. You may need to pardon someone in a very, very messy situation that you never can make public. I mean, there are as I understand it, pardons that to this day are in a skiff. Not for anything abusive, but for something where it was okay to pick your drug lord. We had to pardon one of his lieutenants and get him the heck out of there. And we had to do it by pardon. We couldn't do it by immunity because of X, Y, or Z. So I think that constrains, to my mind, looking at that experience, the federal pardon power. But I understand what you're saying, and I wouldn't be opposed. I mean, I think it'd be fine to have transparency about it, which I actually think President Trump has done. He's been very direct. I see weaponization. I don't trust the government. I think the sentencing was screwed up. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be very clear that I'm doing this because I think the government latched into these people unfairly. And I mean, he pardoned Blagojevich. He said, I thought the case was unfair. Prominent Democrat. I think he is just so distrustful, with good reason, of the department generally. And again, Justin, I completely take your point on the recent pardon. There's a 19-year-old kid. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I meant more broadly. If you look at kind of the First Step Act history, I really do think, I mean, that is where he is coming from, and he's been extremely open and consistent about it. And, maybe that's the structural answer, is just be very open about what you're doing. And, then people can judge it. But again, I haven't heard that many people complain about the pardons as kind of a bread and butter common politics issue. I've heard people just kind of shrug and say, it's politics. Biden pardoned everybody else on his end, on his way out. And you're kind of in this odd murky mess. And I think we'll see how it plays out. But I really do think he's coming at this from a position of the government can latch in you and do things that aren't right. And, if you've defended one of these cases where there is a transparent Brady violation, or you have a cop that everybody in the room knows is lying, I mean, you can see exactly, and I know this, I don't mean this to sound contrived or representative, but I can tell you, having been in the court, I mean, you see stuff like this and you just shake your head and say, this is the United States, man, be better. Be better. And that's, you cannot underestimate the influence on him, particularly when you consider, some of the proceedings against him in some of these cases where, I mean, I know I have liberal lawyers friends whose jaws just dropped at some of the rulings that were going on in that New York case, where it's just like, what is this, 2 prosecutors? And you have to, he's looking at everything from that vein, and that's not unfair because it's not just him. I mean, I can remember still, because we lost it, where I don't think there was anybody who wasn't the prosecutor, the judge who was in that courtroom was there, or there was some press that didn't think the police were lying. It's basically how it's covered, and it still sticks in my craw because it's, come on, man, you're the United States. You should not have put that guy up there. It was pretty clear what was going on, even if you could technically comply with your ethical violations. You want to nail this guy? Yeah. Stipulate he's a drug dealer, nail him on the up and up. This is America. We don't do this.
I certainly agree with that. I guess when I sort of pull back and look at this through a wider lens, my concern is I see this as part of a piece of Donald Trump having understandable heartburn with the weaponization of the legal system, at least in some instances. Obviously, I'm not going to agree with that as much as someone on the right, but I feel like when you look at this and you look at everything it seems like he's been doing to try to essentially stop all public integrity investigations and prosecutions. I mean, it's all kinds of moves throughout the federal government. And I guess my response to that is, if you believe there's a problem with this, and in some instances I would agree, the answer isn't to stop all this. The answer is to reform this. And I don't really see an effort like that going on. And that's my concern. And that's why I think it feels like more like, well, I'm going to help my friends who are being unjustly prosecuted, as opposed to I'm going to try to reform this system in which people can be unjustly prosecuted. And so that's where I have a big problem. Justin?
Sorry, go ahead, Justin. I was going to respond quickly to that, but go ahead.
I think I've said my piece more or less.
Okay, go ahead, Sam. Sorry about that.
You kind of brought in the reform issue, and I actually think that's an interesting issue because I think a lot of people misunderstand what's going on. He hasn't stopped public integrity prosecutions. What he's done, and what Todd Blanche the DAG is doing, is saying we need to take a hard look at them. And they have dismissed some that they think don't meet the standards. And there is a need to adjust the way public integrity thinks. Part of the problem was the way public integrity thought, for better or worse, was our job is to nail politicians. And I think I'm going to take the pick your prosecution against Trump, Jack Smith. And I think he did it before with McDonald. He probably knew there is probably a memo somewhere that will come out that says this conviction will never be sustained by the Supreme Court. But he didn't. And that violates every rule of federal prosecution, but they pursued it anyway. I mean, I don't know anyone who thought, I mean, the guy is one of the few people ever to lose 2 cases 9-0. It's kind of like, what are you doing, man? This is not insider trading where we're trying to adjust the theory because they're weird laws. Everybody gets it's illegal. Politics is a dirty, messy business. It's always been a dirty, messy business. Bribery, straight up bribery, gold bars in your closet. We prosecute that. But some of this other, influence and corruption stuff, you have to understand the nature of the business and you have to look at it from, is this really a crime? I'm not going to prosecute if I think it may well get reversed by the Supreme Court or if I think something else will happen. I'm saying that historically, like I can go, what Blanche has done is said, I'm pushing pause on some of this and I need to bring in new people, retool the team because they're thinking about this thing. And look, this goes back to, I can remember Governor Mandel in Maryland, convicted of honest services fraud, conviction erased when the Supreme Court throws out the statute. But there were, and the prosecutor in that case was an honest guy. He thought he could make it. But part of the disconnect there was just not understanding, hey, politics is a dirty business. And when you all grew up in this knit Baltimore community and one person's the politician and the other are all successful businessmen, that, you give your buddy a $3,000 suit for Christmas. That's just what you did if you were from this community. The same way that, if I'm a trier of fact, I may not hold running from the police if you're a young kid in Baltimore, and you're up on the point. My crime neighborhood, that suffices for a search warrant, but I may not give that much weight if I'm trying the case on the merits. You got to understand all of that politics is a very dirty business. There's a lot of stuff that we don't want to see, but that has always been tolerated. That said, bribery is bribery. Gold bars for favors, we prosecute that. But outside of that,
so
that
Bob,
kind of frame.
gotcha. Bob Menendez should be going to jail, but the other stuff, maybe not so much.
The other cases all had issues with them, and I'm not defending. No one's to this day said anything about how Duke Cunningham was treated. That was sad. He was a war hero, and he straight up took bribes for defense contractors. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just saying you have to understand the business is dirty. You have to understand where people are coming from. You have to treat people with some level of grace in that area like you would in any other area. And you need to make sure that your prosecutions there are rock solid. And all I think they're doing at DOJ is saying, guys, our job is not at all costs to put a scalp on, even if we know the scalp is going to get taken off the wall when the Supreme Court weighs in. Our job is to straight up bribery. Nobody disagrees. Everybody's fine with this guy going to jail. Routine trial. Supreme Court doesn't review. I win 3-0 in the Court of Appeals. And I'm sitting there. The way prosecutors were taught back in the day, you go back to like Robert Jackson's speech. Literally, I could win that motion to keep that evidence out, but I'm not, because I am not getting reversed. I am taking this guy down. I've got him. Like, it does not matter. Sure, go ahead and do that. Sure, go ahead and do that. Literally, old school prosecutors from my grandfather's generation would do that. They'd have plenty of motions they could win to keep evidence out, and they just wouldn't even file them because they'd be like, I've got 10 hours of the guy on tape admitting to the crime. I don't care about the extraneous stuff. I'm still going to nail him. And, maybe that wasn't the right view. Maybe, okay, we apply the rules of evidence. You need some correction. But what's going on at DOJ on the public integrity is completely in the other direction. It's the whole focus is, can I put a scalp on the wall, even if it's only up there for 6 months before it's taken down? And that's not right.
Justin, any final thoughts on this?
No, I'm good.
Okay, well, we're at that point as well. So why don't we wrap things up? We still have a lot to talk about, and we're going to get to it on the midweek show. We're going to get into more stuff on Trump, Ukraine, and Russia, and another judicial case, of Wilmer Hale ruling. It's one of those law firms that Donald Trump is not a big fan of. And Elon Musk, you might have heard, he's leaving Doge. We're going to talk about that as well, maybe some other stuff. We will see, but that is all on the midweek show. We hope you'll stick with us for that. It drops on Tuesday. But for this show, if there's anything you heard here that you liked, disliked, want to take issue with, what have you. And by the way, since this is Sam's first time, we'd love to get your thoughts on him. So you can do that in a bunch of ways. Our main email is mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook and X. We always put links in the show notes. And then there's our Discord discussion forum for supporters as well. I'm on that all the time. So if you get that, I will surely be able to see that. And so, yeah, we also want to say that if you aren't a supporter and you might be in a position to support us, we would really appreciate that. We're not some big New York Times, Wall Street Journal, big media podcast. You're the reason why we can keep on doing this week in and week out. And we give you something for it as well. You get ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get the full-length midweek episode instead of just that 15-minute preview, and access to that Politics Guys Discord group that I mentioned already. And if you want to support us, we have a bunch of ways you can do that. You can just check them all out in the show notes. We'll always put those links there. And if you would like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're just not in a position to support us financially right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help with those algorithms if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And as always, before we go, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,